Hi, I'm Sasha Rosenbaum. This is Ergonatic Podcast, and I'm here today with Matty Stratton, who's my friend for a long, long time. And I'm super excited to have him online today. And we're gonna, of course, talk about DevOps and talk about DevOps days. So before we jump in, Matt, would you like to introduce yourself?
I would, but I'm realizing you titled this a decade of DevOps days. And really, if we're going to be accurate, what we're going to be talking about is a decade of Maddie and Sasha, because I think we met each other pretty much almost exactly 10 years ago. So there is that. Hey, yeah, anyway, yeah, I'm Matty Stratton. I run developer relations for a company called Ivan, and I am one of the global core organizers of DevOps Days. I help run DevOps Days Chicago. I run my mouth about DevOpsy things and spent many years working in various parts of operations and infrastructure and such, and now they pay me to talk about it. And
So,
I'm here in Chicago, if that wasn't clear.
right, and I used to be in Chicago. I
Yeah.
actually just moved, but I'm still helping organize DevOpsDays Chicago for this year. Um, and also, I have a terrible, terrible cold, so I might speak less and nod more because my voice has given up on me, unfortunately. Um,
Indeed.
so, you know, obviously, for those of us who don't know, DevOps, the word DevOps basically started together with DevOps Days, right? That was the whole thing. And
Because Agile
um,
System Administration was too long of a name for a conference.
correct. So the first DevOps Days was more than 10 years ago. It was in 2009 in beautiful Ghent, Belgium. And from there, we basically grew over time to, um, well, thousands of events overall, but probably dozens every year, all over the globe. I'm like looking at the website right now, and there's everywhere from Eastern Europe to Africa to LATAM to Americas, and every essentially, lots of big cities on here, some small cities on here. Um, so, as a core organizer, would you like to talk a little bit about like what is DevOps Days and what's our organization? What the hell do we do?
It's kind of funny because you say as an organization, and in a way, and to the frustration of many, there's not much of it. It's very loosely held, and that's sort of the spirit of the collaboration of DevOps is built into it. The the kind of, if you think about DevOps days, and if you are unfamiliar, like Sasha said, it started in Ghent in 2009, and really the model has not changed. If you look at what the very first DevOps days looked like, and you pull up its program and its schedule, DevOps Days Chicago next week looks a heck of a lot similar, right? It's basically, generally speaking, it's a couple day event. We tend to there's no strict rule about this, but they tend to be like kind of single track in the morning talks. One of the big key components of a DevOps days is participant led content, which traditionally or typically is exhibited in open spaces, but some type of on conference, birds of a feather, lean coffee, something. But usually, again, the tradition is to do open spaces, which is one of those things. As Nathan Harvey, who is a well known DevOps community person and DevOps Days organizer, likes to say, oftentimes people, when they first are exposed to an open space, they say this sounds terrible, and after they've done open spaces, they say, I never want to do a conference a different way. And this is really, we come up with, people suggest things they want to talk about, and then everybody goes in a room to talk about that for 45 minutes, and that's what happens, and it's pretty magic. Uh, there's a couple rules to be a DevOps Days. There's 5. I'm going to see if I can get them all off the top of my head. So one is you must have a code of conduct, and today in 2023, this maybe doesn't sound so revolutionary. I hope it doesn't. I hope most people say, well, of course you would. But that's been kind of the case since almost the beginning. And it was something that was a bit of, not, I won't say a bit of a challenge, but was a hallmark of DevOps Days is a code of conduct. You must have an open call for papers and a submission of content. That doesn't mean that all of your talks have to come from that. The reason for that is so you can't just sort of say, hey, I work at, Target can't have their own DevOps days. That's only inside one company, not to pick on Target, but I'm going to.
Which is, by the way, plenty of companies today run internal DevOps
Yeah,
days, but
they do. They
modeled
theoretically
on
can't call it that. We don't have a trademark or anything, but like you don't. These rules are basically, are you allowed to be on the website? Is kind of what it really. That's because that's about the only thing we can enforce. It's interesting too because people say, why don't you do blah blah blah? And I'm like, global organization. We do not have the lawyers to do that, so it just happens. We could tell some stories about that some other time. So you need to, yes, okay, participant, yeah, code of conduct, OpenCFP, you have to have some type of participant-led content like open spaces, as we talked about. Sponsors, so attendee contact information is never shared. And we say was never shared with sponsors. The reality is never shared with anybody. Like, it sounds like we're picking on our sponsors, but they're usually the ones who want it. But that means that, and that's kind of annoying sometimes as a sponsor to not get that because you're used to getting that from conferences to the list of attendees and their email addresses. And that's been a core tenet of DevOps Days for a long time. And sometimes it makes life hard.
Way, I'm just going to jump in and say periodically I get emails from random people on the internet claiming to have attendee lists for different DevOps Days conferences. And no, they do not. And we never share that, just so you know.
And if it helps you, they try to sell it to me directly sometimes. My favorite is when I've gotten the emails offering to sell me the attendee list of DevOps Days Chicago, which I'm like, well, number one, I already have it. As it happens, I am one of the only, Sasha and I, for example, are some of the only people that would have that. But and the final one is that there is the short way of saying it is you can't buy a talk, but that means there's a disconnect between, just because you sponsor an event does not mean you there's no connection. We sort of firewall those off. And those are kind of the core principles. Beyond that, those are the rules. A lot of other things are the convention. Like I said, tech traditionally, typically you're looking at a 2-day event, single track, talks in the morning, Ignite talks, which are a specific kind of short talk, are kind of a key typical thing, but not every DevOps Days does that, and that's great. One thing I like to think about when you think about the format, so when we started the very first DevOps Days Chicago, which was in 2014, we sat there and we said, okay, so there's this form, okay, the single track, the talks in the morning, the open space in the afternoon. Well, we're going to do it that way at first because we are like, we don't really know what we're doing. Let's do that, but we're going to like figure out how we're going to tweak this over time. Come to DevOps Days Chicago 1 week from tomorrow and see that it looks almost exactly the same way we did it in 2014. And there's a reason, because it works. But it's been fun to see as other events, especially different cities that run theirs over time, have experimented and seen different ways to do things and evolve in how we work together. For example, DevOps Days Austin, Texas is one of the longest running DevOps Days in the United States, and over time they've tweaked and experimented and said, do we do multi-track? Do we do this? And that's cool because we're in a culture of experimentation. And learning from that. But we all still come back to that same similar gravity because the format works. And but from an organization standpoint, it is a very loosely grouped set of very independent local organizers. So a bunch of people in Chicago decided we wanted to try and make a DevOps Day Chicago, and we just did it. With guidance from the global team, and the same thing happens. And this is constantly, again, as someone who's in that sort of advisory, global team, we get requests constantly say, hey, I want to start a DevOps Days in this city that has never been one before. And how can we do that? And we provide that guidance and try to help enable people. And, I will also tell you one of my favorite things in the world is to go to a very first year DevOps Days in a city, because it's incredibly chaotic and everyone's trying to figure out what they're doing, and it's not slick and polished, but the energy is unmatched, versus you look at some of the places like DevOps Days Amsterdam, which I love, DevOps Days Austin, that I finally got to go to for the first time this year, as much as I've been trying to go there since I first even learned what DevOps was. I will say DevOps Days Chicago, DevOps Days Minneapolis, we're pretty well-oiled machines, and that's great. But it doesn't have the same energy as when you go to that very first DevOps Days Knoxville or whatever, and are like,
Birmingham, or
yeah, we just don't know, and it's so fun and super great. So they're both great. You should go to the long-standing ones to put on a great show, and go to the chaotic ones too.
Well, and people come up with, so like Buffalo one year did, during COVID, they did it in the drive-in theater because they didn't want people to have potential for contracting COVID or something like that. And so they basically rented a big drive-in theater and did DevOps Days that way. And it's just kind of, people come up with all sorts of ideas. Let's talk a little bit. So since we spent some time talking about format, I want to talk a little bit about open spaces. So I happened to start this company, Ergonatic, with Andrew Clay Schaefer, who was part of the first iteration of the global core team for DevOps Days. And I think one of his basically main arguments for open spaces, he's like, well, everybody knows that at a conference, the best track is the hallway track, right? Your best ideas come from just having conversations with people working on similar problems, right? But you can't come to your manager and say, I'm going to have 2 days of intense conversations with people from all over the industry, right? That doesn't get you a ticket. So you have to have talks, and you have to have scheduled content and something that like you can show people and be like, hey, this is, big names, whatever, I'm going to learn from this and that person. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, you're exactly right, and I love that statement. And Andrew said that when he was a keynote at DevOpsDays Chicago, and I think it was 2017 was the year of that. And he said, if it was up to him at the first DevOps Days Ghent, it would have been nothing but open spaces. But I knew that nobody would get their manager to let him go if there weren't going to be talks. And I actually think that turned out to be a nice combo, because I've been to events that are all open spaces. Chef Community Summit back in the day was 2 days of nothing but open space. And that actually works in certain ways. But when I think about, and this goes back to our philosophy, and I'm going to speak now as the Chicago organizer hat. I'm not saying this is how every DevOps Days does, but Sasha, you and I have been content chairs for DevOps Days Chicago for many years together. And I think we reason about this similarly, is, to me, the talks exist as fodder for the open spaces. I want it, and this is why I believe strongly in having a single track in the morning, because then everybody's seeing the same talks. So now we go to have open space conversations, and we can talk about, hey, earlier when Roselle Scarlett was talking about this, or Nathan Harvey was talking about that, like that made me think of that. And everyone can say like, oh yeah, I know, because we have that common context. And if we have multiple tracks, we don't have that shared experience. And that's the thing I really love about like a lot of DevOps Days, is it gives us a shared experience together for a couple days. And no matter the size, and some of these events, like Minneapolis runs they unfortunately are not having one this year, but they've 1,000 people, and it feels like 200 people. You're still in a single track with a bunch of people together. It just means that the lines for the restrooms are way longer, and you have to have a longer break because you have 1,000 people instead of 500 people. And I think it's that combination. You can't do just one or the other. I mean, you can, but they're more magical when it's how do they work together, and how are you optimizing as an organizer and content plan, create, whatever you would say, that are building for that. Because like you said, like what Andrew has said, is that ask everybody, the hallway track, that those conversations are the power. But if you don't give some type of framing to it, then we're just going to sit around and talk about, like Game of Thrones or whatever, right? I mean, it's like, how do we get a common experience? How do we help identify the common experience that we all have together without a little bit of framing?
Yeah, and again, I'm saying, like, as someone who cares deeply about content for conferences specifically, like it sets the theme, right? It allows you to, let's say, if we think there are certain things that are happening in our industry that are important to talk about, we can bring them in. And then sometimes you know it better than anybody. It's interesting because you get 300 submissions, and 100 of them will be about a particular topic, and you're like, what is happening? Something happened in the industry that this is now a big deal, and I guess it's the next problem lots of people are trying to solve and stuff like that. And we try to keep DevOps Days local, right? So it's less of Google and Netflix said we need to do X. It's more of your neighbor down the street,
John Deere, or whatever.
Similar regulations, similar situations at work, is working on a similar problem, and we do favor sort of practical stories, right? So we at this enterprise or this small company did X, Y, and Z, and this worked, and it didn't work, and all that kind of learning experiences.
I think trying for that mix is really, really powerful. And I have an Ignite talk I've given a couple times, and it doesn't. You know what? I was thinking about it. I should give this to a group of DevOps Days organizers. They would enjoy it more because if you're not, if you or just any conference organizers, but it's called. I think it's like Conference Talk Selection is Mockumentary Film Editing. And the idea behind it is, so back in a former life, I pretended to be a independent filmmaker for a little while, and I made a mockumentary, a mock doc, kind of the swing dancer version of Waiting for Guffman or Best in Show or whatnot. And we shot this film. It was all improvised. And so we wrote like a very brief outline and kind of tried to do everything as hard as possible. Every way that I made this movie, do not make a movie that way because it's the hardest way to do anything. But what happened is, so we shot all this footage, and it was all this improvised stuff, and we sort of had an outline of the story, and then we went into the editing bay and said, we got to cut this together, and I was like, that story isn't here. The story that we thought was here is not here. Well, we got to find with what we have. I can't go reshoot for several reasons. One being like I didn't have any money, and this was all pickup stuff. So it's like I got to find the story, and we've been down this path as we build our content for our conference together, Sasha, where we can say we think it's this, but we have to take what we get. And it's not like, oh, this is junk, but just we don't, the submissions and the things that people want to talk about doesn't necessarily match the story we want to tell. So we have to find the story. And one of the things I believe strongly, and we never advertise it this way. We tried it one year where we tried to say we had a theme and it didn't really work. But there is always a story. If you look back through the years of, and I can, again, only at this point speak specifically about our DevOps days because that's the one that we have controlled, I'm using that term real loosely, that we have guided and shaped. There is a story. You don't always know what it is, but we know what it is. And you don't have to know what we think it is either, but that helps us pin the things together. But it's a story that we find. It's not a story that we've decided is what's important. We have an idea, but then we're like, how do we connect a through line? We want something that helps you go through this like navigation. And I kind of think about it, whatever you think the story of the conference is the right answer as well, by the way. So it's a little bit of, I'm going to keep going to these filmmaking analogies, but like you think about, if you're familiar with like in Pulp Fiction, there's always a question about what was in the briefcase. And Quentin Tarantino will tell you, it's whatever you think it should be. It doesn't matter. Your answer is right. My friends and I were very obsessed with the movie Memento many years ago, and there was a whole thing about like, was this character actually a cop or not or something? And one of my friends said, I really want to ask the director. And I said, he might not even know, and it doesn't matter. What matters is what you think. And I've made movies where I have one that just, I'm going off on a tangent, but it's okay. It means you don't have to talk. Where we had this short film where there was a question about, with the main character, about his relationship with his, off-screen spouse and kids. And it was one of those things where when we wrote the script, I thought one thing was true. I thought, he was a divorcee, right? But then when we shot the movie, I was like, wait a minute, I think that he's a widow. And then when we edited the movie, I thought yet another thing. And the answer is all of those answers are right? Because it didn't matter. Like it wasn't explicitly, and it was sort of where that connects. So when you think about a content plan or of an event, what matters is, it doesn't matter that you know what I think it is. It matters that I have something, and then you're going to find the story yourself as an attendee and a participant, and it's going to be bigger than anything we tried to make it be.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. I don't think we've ever done this, unless you're going to correct me. Collect what open spaces were about in a particular year and like look back at it. That could tell.
Oh, like retroactively or retrospectively.
Like, hey, what did people wanted to talk about this year?
Man, that's a great idea. And I part of me feels like we could figure that out. The thing is, it's so, because we usually, there is going to be a record, because usually we, in our implementation, end up putting them all into a spreadsheet, and that's how we share them. And I bet those spreadsheets are all around, and it would be, that's a really interesting idea. We should dig into that. Maybe we'll talk about it at our event next week.
And also see like what emerges, like, right? So did the content drive the open spaces? Are the open spaces kind of on their own, like that kind of stuff? And
if I'm full of crap, right? Like I've been spending 10 years of running a DevOps Days thinking that the talks drive open spaces. Maybe I've been wrong this whole time.
No, I think they do, but like you can see the same themes sort of pop up. But I also think that a lot, like maybe there's another emergent theme, right? So like again, people want to talk about something that you didn't predict and the talks didn't kind of show. And so it could be an interesting thing to kind of go back through the open spaces and try to figure out what people want to do.
Yeah, that's a
There's
great
also, as
idea.
we talk about open spaces, there's multiple ways to run open spaces, right? So
Oh.
you can talk. So first of all, anybody can propose a topic, right? And then we kind of vote on topics and try to decide on size of rooms based on how many people want to go there, and
Mm-hmm.
also like what can be scheduled. So sometimes we combine a few if there's like 100 topics that people want to discuss. Um, there's also other things like you can play games at open
Mm-hmm.
spaces. You can do pay talk, which is something Jippo Reed has been doing for a number of years, and that has been really, really interesting and informative. So, it's kind of invaluable way to have a shared experience as a conference attendee.
It's interesting you talked about the games, and it's kind of funny. So I was at the AWS Summit in New York last week, and I was talking to Julie Gunderson at AWS, who's organizer of DevOps Days Boise, and something came up about having games in open spaces, and it was this novel idea. I wouldn't say like this novel idea, but she's like, oh, we should do blah blah blah, and I was like, there's a whole heritage of that, and we just don't do it as much anymore. But there's, again, not to always bring everything back to Schaefer, but like it goes back to early days of playing Werewolf at DevOps Days in an open
My
space.
first memory of Andrew is playing werewolf at open spaces. That
And
100% is it.
where did you go? Did you go to Minneapolis that 2014? Were you in our crew for that? Probably not, because you weren't an organizer that year when we all
Maybe I
road
don't
tripped
remember.
there. Maybe it was the next year. But that's one of my first memories of that too. Is I remember. So just for the little bit of tangent of this, so the very first DevOps Days Chicago was in 2014, and almost none of us who ran that had ever been to a DevOps Days before. I think Jerry Kettle had been there before, and but Minneapolis was having their first DevOps Days a couple months before ours, so a bunch of us decided to like go to that event and kind of see what it was all about. And there's two things that strike me about that are sort of in the little like, oh, how cute. So first of all, again, remember I'm telling you that DevOps Days Minneapolis has become this like 1,000-person thing, and it's amazing and slick and well run and everything. But that was even the chaos of the first one. It was in like this little lecture hall at the university, maybe a couple hundred people. And but I remember it was actually at the time controversial about having a DevOps Days in Minneapolis and Chicago because maybe they were too close to each other. Like maybe we should only do one. And I love that we have gotten to this place where we're saying no, we want to have them more and more and more. But that was the case. There was kind of a thing about like, I don't know, they're kind of close. And for those of you who are not as familiar with U.S. geography, like we're not close. Like in Europe, you would think we're incredibly far away from each other because in Europe everything's like a 5-minute train ride. But but for context, it's like about a 6-hour drive or a hour and a half flight. So it's not unfeasible that you might go to both. But these very localized events, we try to really draw from the local community, and that's another thing that's really kind of important. Is I always feel like we don't like the conflict that happens when you say, oh, we want to have the DevOps Days that's in these two cities that are close to each other. It's more of a problem about getting your sponsors to come because you're like, okay, well, the salespeople for that area are going to campaign. But the attendees tend to be, we want those participants and attendees, they tend to be mostly local. You'll still get a good percentage of people that are like coming in from out of town and they love doing that. But if you look at, again, our Chicago event, and I'll tell you in a second why this is slightly untrue this year, but traditionally, I would say at least 80 to 90% of those attendees probably live within 1 hour of our venue. Like they're all.
And again, this is all intentional, right? Because
Yeah,
if you think
that's what we
about
want.
it,
Yeah.
what we partially was because of sharing local experiences, but the other part is there are many, many people who cannot get a budget to travel to a conference, right? Like many of us are lucky and we can fly anywhere in the world to go to a conference that we want to go. But most people, like in these kind of jobs, get very limited budget for that or none at all, right? And so if you make a conference local and they can just kind of negotiate a couple of days off and show up at the event that's very close to their house or their office, it becomes so much easier to attend.
Well, and one could make the argument that, as we're going into the whatever is happening in our planet and everything like that, that these hyper local events are more responsible, right? That we shouldn't, like, if everybody on the planet is getting on a plane to go to reInvent or to go to KubeCon or something like that, versus being able to do something more local. And there's still value, I think, in the more centralized because there's some cross-pollination, and it's really great to be able to say, what do you learn from people that are doing their thing in other places? But sustainability and multiple definitions of that term, the local community, things like that are more sustainable, both environmentally sustainable, but also sustainable from a community. One of the things I thought was interesting when we look at what happened with COVID, there's a lot of big centralized events that didn't make it after COVID, right? Like, because they couldn't, Velocity, a lot of these central places, because if you're going to have something big enough that lots of people come, the stakes are really high from cost and whatever. But like, hey man, I'll tell you, DevOpsDays Chicago, we're not going to talk the exact numbers, not because it's a secret, but just because it influences other different things. But like, it's not trivial as far as our budget goes. If you were to look at our line budget about how much our event costs, it's not a small amount of money, but that doesn't mean you have to spend that amount of money to have a local community conference. You could do it for $20,000 if you wanted to. It would be different. It would be smaller, but it's possible.
If you're limited on budget, and there are things you can do, such as not cater meals, for instance, which is very expensive, or not have a super prime location and stuff like that. So, like, yeah, if you're struggling,
or not hosted in an expensive city like Chicago or New York,
that's a whole different,
or San Francisco,
Yeah, but also the other thing I wanted to mention is, like, we keep our tickets intentionally cheap, right? So like, again, it's a nonprofit, so whatever money we make from sponsorships and tickets go into.
Boom! You just reminded me of another DevOps Days rule that I didn't state, which is that basically, in not so many words, money cannot go back into anybody's pocket after it's done. So while it's not technically required to be a not-for-profit, because that has a specific legal meaning that not everybody has, that is not, these events do not exist for individual or corporate profit, which means when we have money left over, if we have that, it goes back into the event or goes into other events, or we donate it or something like that. And I think I just want to call out, thank you for mentioning that. I forgot that was another key part of that.
Which I think is part of the reason there's so many spin-offs now, of various conferences related to DevOps, because people kind of want to be for profit in these spaces sometimes, and there's nothing wrong with that. But like, DevOps Days is about kind of making it accessible to as many people as we can, and like you mentioned, if we have money left over, that means that we're either keeping it for next year, or we're donating to events in other cities that maybe didn't have as many sponsors or things like that.
For sure. So I want to just mention one thing because I think it's interesting. I said, for example, our event here at Chicago this year is going to be the makeup of attendees is maybe a little less local than usual. Still, the majority are local. When I look at our attendees, but a little bit more of an international flavor, and partially that's because the day before DevOps Days Chicago, which so today is Tuesday, so a week from today this will be happening. DevOps Days Chicago starts a week from tomorrow. About 100 people who run at DevOps Days all around the world are all coming together in Chicago, and we're going to spend a day together learning from each other about how to be better at what we do. And this was inspired in 2019 for the 10th anniversary of the first DevOps Days in Ghent. The organizer of that said, hey, let's have a special little day before. And a lot of people came in from all over the world. It was an amazing day. And one of the things that I just thought was so fascinating about that day was there were more people at that DevOps Days organizer day than attended the very first DevOps Days that ever happened. And that is important. And that's not to say because not many people went to the first one, but it speaks to how broad and how global and how distributed this came. And it was kind of a big bummer because we're like, we should do this more often. And then what happened about 4 months later? Well, COVID. So we decided just a little bit later than we planned. We said we want to do this again and thought we'd have one that was North America focused, because just for distributing. And my new theory is I want to travel less for work, so I just want everything to come to me. So I was like, well, let's have it here at Chicago, because that's where I already am. And I'm really excited. It's a week from today, and we've got a great group of people. And as an organizer of Chicago, I'm actually a little bit excited to show our event off to our friends from all over the world who run their DevOps Days in different ways, and see what they think of the party that we throw and the content we create. And really, honestly, it's not even about showing off our event. I'm really excited to, for lack of a better word, show off our community here, right? We have Chicago has the Midwest. I grew up here, both literally and also professionally, and there's kind of an interesting way when we think about adoption of things. The Midwest of the U.S. is not the fastest, but when we get into something, we really get into it. And I always sort of look at it when I think about, again, this is U.S. centric, but it's sort of like the West Coast picks things up first, right? Like we kind of got like the bleeding edge stuff, and we're going to do all our like Valley innovation, disruption, blah, 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 blah. And then it's sort of like the East Coast of the U.S. will pick it up a little bit more on the finance side, and they're like, okay, New York and Boston can kind of drive things. In the meantime, here in the middle of, maybe you'll call, some people derogatorily will call us flyover country, but we sit there and we watch and we go, okay, let me see what you're doing. Let me see what you're doing. Okay, got it. Here we go. Right. And that is, I've seen that. I mean, there's a lot that happens here. And I think back to the first DevOps Day Chicago in 2014, and one of our speakers and community members, J. Paul Reed, that you mentioned before about with like TalkPay and everything. He talked about, we did an episode of the Arrested DevOps podcast at that event. And he said, hey, this has been really interesting, because Paul comes from, at the time, currently is West Coast, but it's been stuff. And he said, hey, just the people I was talking to here are at these organizations that are solving real problems. Not that you don't solve real problems in other places, but like, the sort of the Midwestern thing. It's like, we work for a living here, right? We're out there and we're doing retail. We're doing, which exists in other places, I know, but like, it's just interesting to see that the take is a little different. And I think it's going to be pretty cool for people who haven't maybe spent time in this community and the way that we work here, to get that exposure and maybe say, oh, okay, that's a little different. And especially people all over the world. One of the most amazing things as a developer advocate, when I was traveling a lot and got to go and spend time with companies and communities all over the world, was sit there and say, like, how do they do this in Australia? How do they do this in Germany? How do they do this in the Nordic regions versus in the US versus in Canada versus in South America? And how do we cross-pollinate and learn all that stuff together? And it's really amazingly awesome.
Yeah, I always kind of tell the same story about what it's like to kind of move to Chicago, but
oh yeah,
I moved from outside the U.S., right? And it was kind of random that I ended up in Chicago. And if you are outside the U.S., what happens is everybody who moves to United States moves to either because I'm in technology, so it's Seattle, San Francisco, and then New York. These are the three cities that everybody knows and everybody targets. And kind of people outside the US don't really look for opportunities in other places. And so all of my friends would continuously keep asking, like, why are you in Chicago? Like, what's this? Like, there's no technology in Chicago. And the biggest surprise I had when I moved to Chicago was there's a lot of technology in Chicago. In fact, there's, like you said, there's technology for people who solve real problems. There's maybe not as many offices of the big high-tech firms, although they exist, and I ended up working for Microsoft for many years, right? But there's maybe not as many opportunities to work for a big tech or a unicorn startup, but there's plenty of technology and plenty of people solving real-world problems, and it's a very interesting market to be in if you're in tech.
It's interesting, too, that you even said that, and I kind of would have always thought that way, but I've also been connected in certain ways, and we do have our sort of mini valley startup world that is Chicago. There's quite a bit here that people don't know about, and you think about like the 606 stuff and whatever, but it's like, I'm going to name a couple places that you didn't know came from here, like Grubhub. Now, granted, I don't know but like there's that entire, and Grubhub kind of invented that whole model, and that interestingly enough came out of another Chicago area kind of startup called Classified Ventures. And so if you're from like cars.com and apartments.com is all started here. And a couple of the folks who worked over there are the folks who went on to start Grubhub. Orbitz, which was very innovative and stuff like that. And I always sort of say, like, if you are in the Chicago area and of a certain not pedigree, but certain age and time and stuff like that, you probably went through Classified Ventures or Orbitz at some point if you were in the startup land. There's a lot of really cool stuff, and we don't really see it as much. And there's interesting innovation, but that's not, again, what we identify this area as much. And it's not, I don't want to say it's so much that it doesn't exist, but that's not the focus, like, but we have it, and it's an interesting way to connect that. And I think we're going to see, we always see interesting folks coming to our events and doing that who are building that. But it is still like, yeah, we're like talking about, John Deere, and Minneapolis is another one, again, back in the Midwest. And people wonder, they're like, Minneapolis is like the best kept secret of one of the most amazing DevOps communities and tech communities in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of great tech that happens there. With Target, Best Buy, there's huge healthcare companies in there that do really innovative things, and some less innovative things, but yeah, it's always the little pockets you don't expect. And, again, that was one of the fun things about doing work for other companies. And you sort of sit there and you're like, there's some stuff happening in Kansas City that ain't nobody really heard of outside of the Midwest, but man, is it pushing some needles, right? So it's never where you expect, but it's there.
Sorry, if you're watching the video, you can see I'm coughing.
I know. I was trying to not have you be the one that had to say a thing, but I was, that was the timing.
So, I'll give you one more prompt. So we talked about being single track, and there's benefits and downsides for being a single track. So why don't you talk a little bit about that? Well,
I would love to. While you try to, like, not
drink tea.
Not gag on your tea or whatever. So, so one thing, like I said, so one benefit of single track that I already talked about is everybody's seeing the same thing, so that helps drive some conversations. A downside is not everybody gets to know what they want, and one of the things, because when you go single track, it means you can't go as deep, because. So we run into this, and I'll tell you a little bit how we've solved that for Chicago in a second. But you'll get talks that are like, "Hey, I've got this great talk about like optimizing Kubernetes, for container ships that are traveling the Atlantic Ocean." I was being very niche there. I am never going to put that on the main stage in a single track event, because that's a smaller subset of people that will absorb from that. So that's a downside. You tend to have to become a little bit more, I don't want to say general in your content, but it has to be a little bit more
relatable for a broader
relatable.
audience.
That was the word I wanted. I couldn't find relatable. Now the other side of this, though, is I like it because it gives you a little bit of your eat your vegetables stuff, I might say. So we've talked about this before too, which is to say, okay, you want to get to the Kubernetes talk, you got to watch the testing talk, because you're not going to get up and walk out of the main hall and skip one talk. Some people will, and that's fine. But generally speaking, there's even a social pressure. And that means, okay, if you were to opt in, you might see someone's giving a talk about a topic that you wouldn't necessarily normally select. But if it's in your single track, you're going to watch it because you sort of have to, because you're sitting in a chair. And then you might go, that was really interesting. And I would never have chosen to go to the room that had that. But because it was part of my one channel I could look at, it kind of let me get a little bit of a different exposure. And one of the things we do, and on our program in Chicago, we started doing this. I talk about it like it's some new thing we're doing. We've probably been doing this since 2015 or 2016. 2016, I think, is the first year we did this. Is we said in the afternoons during our open spaces, we have a secondary track running that is more of, we've internally and never externally would call them this, but we call them our tech talks. And it's not because we don't talk about tech in the morning, but it's more of our specialty talks, or maybe we run a workshop or something. And that lets us sit there and say, have this talk that's very specific about like about configuring Jenkins properly in AWS, right? Cool. There's probably 100 people at this conference that want to see that. And we can do that then, but we're not going to put that in front of 600 people of everybody, because someone's like, I don't even use AWS. We're on Azure, so I don't even care about this. It's not even helpful, and it's not even going to be relatable to me in any way. But I like to have the things where you're like, you might not think it's relatable to you, but it is. That's the advantage of single track.
I would say that as a speaker, I really like single track conferences, and this is something that not everybody thinks about unless you have experienced both. But a lot of times what happens is you go to a 3,000 people conference as a speaker, and then unless you have the keynote, right, your room probably has 30 to 60 people, right? Something like that, and like a lot of times. And you just basically end up talking to a tiny, tiny subset of these folks. And also you competing with, like, a lot of times, like I'm looking at the schedule and there's 3 speakers I want to see, and that's so difficult to choose. And I'm like, it's not that I don't want to see the talk or the speaker, but I physically can't,
You
right? And
can't be
so
in
like
two places at once. And that's
right.
the one thing that was interesting with virtual events is sometimes you can. And and if they're built right, but that also will go down a different like rant I have about this has to do with pre-recorded and not recorded virtual talks, but I'll get to there. But the competing thing is actually very real, and it comes up in interesting ways. I remember years ago when I worked for Chef, and we would have ChefConf. They still do, but I'm not part of it. So Disney was a well-known customer of Chef, and oftentimes engineers from Disney would give talks at ChefConf during the various breakouts. But one of the things that was the rule from Disney was those talks could not be recorded. So if you were giving a talk at the same time as someone from Disney, no one would come to your talk because they were like, well, I can see your talk. Your talk will be recorded, but this is the only time this is going to happen. So I have to be there because I don't have the opportunity to see it later. So it was really rough to be opposite that. There's a very interesting story about competing talks, though, and about our perception of what people are looking for. So many years ago, and I never remember which is the name. I'm not even going to name the conference or the organization, but there was this very traditional IT service management, ITIL kind of oriented company/conference that has this very, very large event that is very much oriented towards ITSM, traditional service management. And they decided one year, and I think it was 2015, they said, we should have a DevOps track. And so they invited 3 people to come speak in their DevOps track. They invited J. Paul Reed, Damon Edwards, and yours truly, Matty Stratton. And the first thing that I thought was crazy about them with their DevOps track is they put all the talks at the same time. So the 3 DevOps talks that existed in this conference were at the same time.
This is not how you do a track, but okay.
Well, maybe it wasn't even. Maybe I don't even. I want to be fair. I might be misspeaking by calling it a track. It was they were going to add DevOps content. But that's so I'm sitting there. So this is me, Matty, looking at saying, "Oh my God!" So comparatively, I'm thinking no one's going to come to my session because I'm at the same time as J. Paul Reed, who I love to see as a speaker, and he has these insightful talks about the nature of failure and all this deep stuff. And then you have Damon Edwards, who helped invent the idea of CAMs and big thought leader and all this stuff. And then you got me. Who the hell am I? I had a packed house because I gave a talk that was, what the hell is DevOps, fundamentally, right? Paul is giving the talk I want to go to. And Damon was giving whatever he was giving. And so Damon and I both had pretty full rooms. And I had dinner with Paul Reed afterwards. We went out for because we're in Vegas, we went for a good steak dinner and stuff. And Paul was like, there were 6 people in my room because it was the wrong and it wasn't his fault. It was great content. But again, most of the people coming to this conference were just like, I don't even know what DevOps is. The thing that I found amusing about this conference is none of us were ever invited back again. And every time they've done it since then, they've had their list of DevOps content. And I'm like, it's a bunch of dudes in suits that I've never heard of before, but it's probably exactly what they want at this conference. So good for them. They did not invite the DevOps weirdos back again after that year. But it was that perception, right? It was the, oh man, I'm going up against this talk I really want to see. And I've had this experience with like Andrew, right, before, where I'm like, I am such a nerd. I will watch him talk. I will watch Andrew read the phone book because it's going to be weird and interesting and insightful, but it's not necessarily, but I also sometimes I'm like, I don't necessarily, depending on the context, I might not be worried about going up against Andrew because maybe it's a bunch of people who are like, I don't even know the first thing about what we're talking about. And this deep thought that Andrew wants to give that day, not to say that Andrew can't speak to everybody because he absolutely can, but, I always do. We were at an event together recently, and I was like, I don't know if anybody else in this room is digging this, but I'm sitting in the front row while Schaefer's talking about what he's talking about, and I'm like, you might as well give this talk to me. As it happens, people loved it. It was at GoTo Chicago a few months ago, but it was funny because I was in the front, so I didn't see everybody behind me. I'm like, I don't know if anybody else is along for this ride, but like, this might as well be like Andrew being like, all right, Maddie, here we go. let me write a talk for you, and that was that. So
you brought up something very interesting that I've been thinking about, and it's so we've been at it. I can't calculate 14 years, right? Like if you count from the first event, and it seems like I still have a lot of conversations with people in technology industry about what DevOps is.
Sure.
And so I feel like this now split. So it used to be for years and years, we would have a lot of conversations about what DevOps is. And now we simultaneously having conversations about that and about how DevOps is dead or DevOps is legacy. and so it can happen in the same day, right? That's kind of very interesting. So, what do we think? Like, judging from your experience, from my experience, like how does this arc of development has happened? And I will preface this with, I have seen a lot of changes happen in our industry that I think a lot of them were kind of led or propagated by DevOps Days. Like DevOps Days conferences were highly instrumental in spreading certain technologies and certain practices. And I think it has improved the lives and work environment of many people, and also their ability to achieve results they wanted to achieve. But it's also interesting, like, to kind of reflect on our general journey.
So you said a lot of words there. If you're sort of saying, like, what are we kind of thinking about this from the context of what are the influences, is this really the what has changed in the last 10 plus years kind of look back? Or
I think are we so kind of a couple questions. One is, have we made the world better? Because that's what we set out to do all these years ago, right? And the second question is, like, are we done making the world better? Like, are we coming up on, have we exhausted the content, the movement, the whatever? So again, too many words, but like there's many spin-offs of DevOps Days conferences now, and there's also conferences like, SRE conferences and platform thinking conferences, whatever. And if you go to these conferences, you also discover that they look exactly like DevOps Days, maybe not in the format, but in the content and a lot of things people talk about. It's like, well, yeah, okay, like innovative thinking. We've been talking about this for years, like, right, stuff. So what's happening here? Like,
okay, that's fair. And I recorded an episode of Arrested DevOps last week. It's not published yet, so subscribe at arresteddevops.com and you'll find it come out in like maybe a week or two, or more than a week or two. I should say more like a month. I know my schedule, but anyway, long story short, I had Adam Jacob, who, founder, creator of Chef, is System Initiative stuff now, been around for a minute. And we kind of talked about this a little bit about, like, okay, what did DevOps start out to do? What happened along the way? Did we get there? I feel like I've had this conversation a lot lately. But one of the things when we look at and say, did we accomplish everything back? Because it's very easy for us right now, and it's not atypical for us to look back between now all the way back to what's happened since 2009 and to feel pretty jaded and kind of pissed off and say, like, okay, y'all screwed it up. We screwed this up. We had a chance and we messed it up. And there is a context and perspective that's necessary. And I'm going to illustrate this with a story. So when I was working at Chef, I had lots of customers who were going through their transformation and trying to get better. And I had the luxury and the amazing experience of being able to work with these people and say, like, cool. And so one of those was the Chicago Mercantile Exchange here in Chicago. And when I was leaving Chef and I was going to go work somewhere else, and I would meet with these customers of mine and that you knew for over years and years, and every few months, and it was time for my little, like, regular meeting with them, and I was like, okay, yeah, and by the way, sad, boo, I'm leaving and we won't be doing this together anymore. We're all part of the community, all this stuff. And one of the people on the team, when we're sitting there in that meeting, said, Matty, I'm really disappointed in us. Like, we didn't live up to everything we could have done through this time we've been working together. And I said, are you kidding me? Allow me to remind you of where you were when we started doing stuff together a couple years ago, because I have the perspective of someone who's sort of looking from the outside a little bit. Like, I'm not in the muck every day like you are of your stuff. So you're justifiably angry because you're like, man, we could do so much more, and I feel like we haven't accomplished it. I'm like, but you're not thinking about how far you've come. So arguably, DevOps has made everything suck less, right? If we put the Wayback Machine back to 2009 and how we were building and deploying and running software 14 years ago, it is better now. It is absolutely better now. There are things that suck now that didn't suck then because we didn't even know it could be a thing that could suck. Okay, so that's fair. And maybe we've created some new problems. No maybe about it. We absolutely have. But It is better. And this is human nature, because we look at this too, and and I'm gonna get the numbers wrong. And if I was prepared properly and I was Andrew and had all the right stats, I could do this right. But it's like a crime, right? Is a thing. It's like people say, "Oh my God, crime is so bad now compared to the way it used to be." And you're like, actually, it's not. It's bad. It sucks. We're not saying it's good, but things have improved dramatically. Our life is better today. As much as it feels like we're living in a hellscape, so many things are better today than they were 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 30 years ago. But there's new problems that we didn't have then. That's totally true. So there's that. That's one thing. I just want to be clear. But we did mess it up. We have not lived up. The dream of the 90s is not alive in DevOpsDays or whatever, if I want to do a Portlandia thing.
We don't have flying cars. We do not have flying cars.
I think that's a good thing, to be quite honest. I would be scared beyond belief of people. People can't handle cars that stay in 2 dimensions, in 2 axes. You had a third one. We got problems, man. So. Yeah. But
so I had a very similar situation, or very similar story. I think probably 3 years ago, whatever. We were talking with DevOpsDays Chicago organizers, and we're sitting down, and I had this moment, and I was like, "Oh, we've been doing this for so many years, and I just feel like, what have we done? What have we accomplished?" And a couple of people, like Jeff Smith, who's going to be our MC this year, and has been involved for many years with the organization, I basically was like, "Are you kidding me? Like, my job used to suck really bad, and now it doesn't. Like, I get paid better. I'm doing things that involve me thinking and solving smart problems instead of clicking buttons. And people appreciate my work, and I get to improve the overall well-being of the organization. It gets recognized." And again, a bunch of people nodded to it. And we did change the industry for the ops side of things, right? From sort of the normal state being very manual and very painful and very sort of downstream of development, where all the problems come to roost, but to something much better. I guess my question is, I think we sort of in the pendulum always swings, and I feel like we're in a swing of the pendulum to the opposite side again. So we were talking about sort of improving the collaboration between developers and operations, and then I think a SRE book was very, very important to this whole thing, and it came out, and a bunch of people started trying to implement the practices, but also a bunch of people just kind of renamed the teams to SRE and continue to do the same thing they've always done. And I think there is a lot of it. I say this I started off as a developer. I was a developer for many years before I came to the ops side, and I kind of did a little bit of opsy things along the way, and that's kind of what opened me up to that perspective. But I wrote code for many years, and I feel like there's over catering to developers again, and the over we talk about developer experience, developer productivity constantly, and we talk about specifically deploying faster. Like, that's the only metric that people seem to look at. And then I'm like, where are your ops in this? Like, are your ops still waking up every Saturday? Like, are your ops still kind of doing things manually because you don't give them time to write code? Or I've seen a lot of organizations basically say, "Oh, SRE says we need to do software development in ops, so now we're just going to reward people who do software development in ops, and those people who handle incidents are, again, lower level, whatever stuff, and kind of that kind of trend." So ops kind of getting sidelined again, if you will.
I mean, it's sort of like we're just sort of shuffling it around a little bit, and there's a couple things to unpack there. So one problem, and I run into this myself professionally, is the term developer is overloaded. There are lots of places where, because we just don't have a good shortcut word for technical practitioner, and in a lot of cases, I'm not saying this is always the case, but there are places, and this gets weird and confusing and annoying. And as someone who has the ops pedigree and was the cranky old sysadmin for many years, and it's always bugged me a little bit because I'm like, wait a minute, but what about this? And then I find myself having to do it myself too. I talk about developer growth within my organization and within my function, and I am not only talking about software engineers, but Amazon has the same problem. I've talked to plenty of my friends in AWS who are just like, AWS likes to call them builders. And then the problem is like nobody knows what the hell that means either, right? Like we all invent these new words. I'm not saying that we're not sidelining ops, certainly not. But there is one part of that is important to think about is we just don't have a good way to think about the other people. But this is a very big problem. And you and I have talked about this before, and I've ranted about it, and other people have, and, we could go back and say, we don't like to say there's a single root cause, it's contributing factors, but one of the big root causes, the book, The New Kingmakers, right? What was that about? It's about like software's eating the world, developers, all sorts of things. And I remember a very early episode of Arrested DevOps, when we were maybe episode 10, maybe. Don't go look it up because it probably isn't 10, but it's about that. And remember Trevor and I had a guest on. And at one point in the thing, the guest said, well, the ops is there it was something to the effect of to maximize the time of your most valuable resources, your developers. And the important thing to know is that this person who was a guest worked for a customer of the company that we worked at the time, Sasha. And so I couldn't yell at them because of that. But boy, like my fingers in the chat I was sending to my podcast co-host, I was like, oh, I'm so mad, right? But that was sort of the contention. It was like, okay, and that's not uncommon. I do think it's better. I think we're understanding that ops is a skill. There have been a few places that I see bits of this, but it seems like in some ways, to your point, like maybe we lost that thread. And now we're just like, well, we're now just going to call them platform teams, and that's how we shove them off somewhere else, and that's a whole other thing. And we've done several episodes of my podcast about Plat-Eng and what does it mean and what does it not mean, and it's frustrating and it's not. But I think back to one of the things, though, is while maybe we feel like ops is sidelining again, we're still treating ops as more of a discipline than as a bunch of server janitors. Right, and that was the thing to remember too. Is while maybe we took 6 steps forward and now we've taken 4 steps back, we did take 2 steps forward, which is great.
No, so I never want to say that we didn't make progress. We made tremendous progress, right? And
I'm not being apologetic for like it being messed up either. By the way, I just
but it's an interesting trend that I see, and it's kind of like. And it coincides with, this conversation about DevOps being dead and all that stuff. And it's like, I think we talk about this a lot. So like simultaneously a number of trends happen, right? And one of the trends is everybody went to SaaS, right? So yep. we used to ship software on CDs and whatnot, right? And now everybody's running a SaaS product. And if you're running a SaaS product and if it is successful, and hopefully you want it to be successful, over time, your cost of running it is dwarfing your cost of development, right? Like your operations are actually much more important over time than your development. And it is kind of very counterintuitive to me that despite that, there's this new trend of like continuously talking about developer experience and whatnot, right? And like I'm like, I know ops X doesn't sound as cool, but like can we talk about that?
Well, I think there's a couple of places, and again, back to the joke about like no root cause, and we say, well, there is one root cause, it's the Big Bang, and if it's not that, it's late stage capitalism. But that's the problem, right? Because if we go back to a couple metaphors that maybe won't hold up as I walk them through, but I've always thought, and again, this being the person that's an ops person, and a sysadmin, and all this stuff, in so many ways, operations, we always say like being in ops is like being a corporate lawyer, right? Nobody knows what you do until you mess it up. Number one, right? But that hyper growth, right? Like it's reliability and such is very important, but that's not what impresses the street or impresses your investors because they want to see how are you growing. Like while we know it's a proxy, right? Like having unreliable systems affects your churn and your renewal and everything, but that's not what lets you. And I'm not going to name names here, but there are several companies that I'm like, you had this thing you did. And I look at what you do now, and I'm like, I don't even know what you do. And not only that, but you've actually gotten bad at the thing you did. But you were pressured from your investors, from the street, from all this to say, how do you continue to get that hyper growth? And you have to do it by taking on new things. That's why companies are like, all of a sudden we're an AI company, and now we do this, and now we do this, and like, dude, you were just really good at selling shoes, but now you suck at selling shoes because you're not investing on that anymore. But that's not what's hot. That's not what attracts new business, right? Or whatever. But that's what keeps your business.
There's definitely a problem with being a unicorn, right? Like, because you need that continuous growth, and it's like at some point you just like you can't grow. Like what makes sense is like you've saturated the market and you have your niche and you do the thing, right? And unfortunately, if you're taking VC money, then usually you have to keep somehow finding new millions of users, new millions of customers every day, which is, in many ways unreasonable. So I think we're about at time for when we're going to start wrapping up. And I wanted to kind of we got to this topic already, but I kind of wanted to maybe take our hats off as organizers or as representatives of DevOpsDays, Core or Chicago or whatever, and just where do we think this is all going? We've been doing these conferences for so many years, and we feel like this is highly instrumental for the community. We're still having very productive conversations, but is this time to reinvent ourselves? Is this again, we have many unsolved problems in the space we should be solving. What do you think is gonna?
I think about that because I look at and again, we're taking the house. We're not speaking about saying this is authoritative. This is not how the organization is going to go, either the local Chicago organization or global. But there's some really specific things that I see, areas that we need to evolve and change, and things have gone. But also, do we hit the point when we're forcing something? And this is something that happens in DevOps days, especially those of us who've been running them and doing them for 10 plus years, where we really want the world to be a certain way. And the world has kind of told us they don't want to be that way. And we have to say, how do we adjust to that? Right? We've had and it's not like, hey, these are my principles. If you don't like them, that's okay. I have others. Right? But it's like, okay, how do we continue to evolve? So number one, there's certain evolutions, and I'm gonna state one that's come to mind, and I keep thinking about this and need to do something about it. Is we have a rule. One of the 5 rules is you have to have a code of conduct, and frankly, in 2023, big effing deal. Having one is not what matters anymore. Having an enforced code of conduct that has certain tenets to it is the thing. And how do we start to evolve into saying maybe that's the world now? Is if we were on if a core philosophy of DevOps Days is about that inclusivity and safety. 10 years ago, you did that by just having a code of conduct, but now we have to evolve that to something more. Maybe I'm using that as an example of a way to evolve. There's also and then what do you call it? And how we say, there's definitely people who are like, it's not a DevOps Days if it's not single track. That's just how we do it. It's like, well, is it? Or if it's about certain thing. But also, what DevOps Days has done is maybe the world needs something a little different now. Maybe the evolution is not to say, well, now let's just call it Platform Engineering Days and maybe get more money. Actually, maybe that's the trick.
Topic called the report, Platform Engineering Report. So
well, I'm actually thinking about this a little bit. So there's sort of an anecdotal story. I like to say Pete Cheslock says this when we talk about the title DevOps Engineer. And it's like, well, if you change your title from system engineer to DevOps engineer, you get a 30% bump in salary. So I'm always like, yeah, go get your bag. So maybe if we change, maybe that's true for platform engineering. So if we call it Platform Engineering Days instead of DevOps Days, maybe we can charge 30% more of the sponsors, because now we've given ourselves a new name. But if this has always been kind of a way of doing things, what are the things, how much of this is us telling our community how they should be versus asking our community what they need? And it's always suspect to play the Henry Ford thing, because there's reasons that he wasn't great in certain ways, but there's that anecdotal thing about if I asked my customers what they wanted, they would say, I want a faster car. And we're too busy telling our community they don't want a faster car. But in the meantime, their bosses are saying, this car, I need a faster car. Why can't you build me a faster car? Like, how much of this, like how much of DevOps we said came from practitioners building it and doing that? And maybe are we turning ourselves into now saying, no, you're doing it wrong. And maybe in a way we're driving this too much and we're not listening as much as we should. I don't know. I'd like to see how do we evolve to meet the needs of our community, but still challenge the community so that their reach exceeds their grasp. Because, or else, what is a DevOps for?
I will. So we'll introduce one more thing here that I've been thinking about, and it's so one of the things that happened with DevOps Days is it's not very prescriptive, right? Like, so DevOps Days, DevOps in general as a philosophy is not very prescriptive. And then if you look at something like Agile, for instance, there was a ton of prescriptive movements that sprung out of Agile. And while it can,
but was there? Was there supposed to be?
Well, so here's an interesting conflict though. On one hand, not being prescriptive is good because like you kind of don't want people to just monkey the prescription without kind of understanding the core principles and trying to do that. On the other hand, if I come into this space right now and I Google for DevOps, I will absolutely find articles co-opted by corporate marketing of all sorts of people trying to sell me things. And so then I see young people with titles in the DevOps space coming in and thinking that DevOps is CI/CD tools or something. And like they actually don't have the broader perspective at all.
So that's the thing. If you are not prescriptive, you are leaving a vacuum and it will be filled. If I'm going to, I will put it this way, to use the analogy, I talk about, like, I have dogs, I have Australian Shepherds, they're a working breed. And the thing about having a smart working breed dog is the dog needs a job. And if you don't give it a job, it will find a job and you won't like the job that it comes up with because it's probably going to involve eating your shoes. So the same thing. In the absence of prescription will happen. So we think about a couple of the things that happen and where this comes. So ITIL was very prescriptive. That's its whole point. And that's a big part of why it's heavily adopted, because it's literally people are like, just tell me what to do. And it is, if you do this, you will get this outcome. And people, we think people don't want that, but
checklist of
totally. And actually, it's a little bit more nuanced than that because you end up with a vendor's implementation of it. But still, it is literally the ITIL infrastructure library. It is a set of books that tell you how to run your service desk and your IT infrastructure. And there's value to that in a way. Then we look at Agile, and Agile was like, we're not going to be prescriptive. We're going to give some principles, but it is literally, but then what do people think of? They think of Scrum. Agile is not Scrum. There's nothing in Agile that says you need to do Scrum or XP or any of that stuff. And again, you want to get Andrew wound up, right? Have this conversation with him, So then with DevOps, we tried to be really hands off, and you know what? Exactly what happened. But people are clamoring to say, tell me how to do it. So if those of us that have the great ideas are like, but we can't tell you how to do it, you got Joe Marketer over here. By the way, I work in a marketing department. I report to the CMO, so I can say whatever I want about marketing. But you got Joe Marketer over there, or Snake Oil guy, or thought leader, bot leader dude, who's going to be like, okay, well, I'll tell you. In the meantime, 100%. We're standing here, you and me and Andrew and Jabe and Nathan and all these people. We're like, oh, no, we cannot tell you the DevOps. You must discover it for yourself. And everyone's like, well, that seems hard. I actually have work to do. And by the way, I would like to work until 5 o'clock, and I would like to go home and go play with my kids and not have to invent the world. Just tell me what to do so that I can get my damn paycheck and be awesome at what I do. Yep. So I think we screwed that up. Honestly do. And in our attempt to, one cannot be told what the DevOps is. One must discover it for themselves. Meanwhile, we're over here being, Morpheus that's saying you must discover the matrix, and then Agent Smith in the marketing department of DevOps tool number 59 is like, I will tell you what the matrix is. It's this. And you're like, cool, I just needed to know.
There's always a Neo, right? But how many Neos are there compared to the people who are inside the matrix and will never take the red pill, right? I mean,
I feel like this is where you get the David Tennant and Doctor Who going, that metaphor got away from me a little bit there, but we're going to find it. There's some weird connection, but I think that's the reality. And I also, I'll give you examples, and I feel like I'm just not talking trash, but so when we were at Chef, we had a product. It was called Chef Delivery, and it was a continuous delivery, whatever pipeline product that everybody's trying to invent. And part of its entire point was that it was not prescriptive. We're like, hey, do it however you want. Here's the thing. And the customers went, that's awful. Please tell us what to do, right? Because they're like, by the way, my job here is to make cars and ship the software for cars and not to invent the best way to figure out our particular bespokeness. And it is this weird balance because you have to be prescriptive, but it's like, how do you show patterns? And I think we've actually done this. We've screwed this up in DevOps, and we've also gotten it right in certain places. The problem was I think we took a little too long, and we still were a little too general. So we look at things like Accelerate, we look at Dora, we look at where that went, and we said, okay, here's patterns. But they still were ways to understand, and even that was light years beyond what we'd had before, because a lot of it was gut, right? We didn't have the science to say this actually changes this, but it's still based on how do you do, like, again, we need to have, but there's not one true DevOps, but maybe there's like 4, right? It's like, which of the 4 is you?
There's no right way to write software, but there's plenty of wrong ways, right?
Oh.
You can identifiably, like, someone made this. There's no right way to cook a turkey or raise a child or write software, right? Like, but there's wrong ways to do these things. Like when you know for sure this is not how it should be done.
Sasha Bates likes to say every snowflake has 6 sides, right? So let's get as many weird metaphors in the last minute and a half as we can. Ready, go.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, I do think so. I think that the SRE book was quite a lot better at being prescriptive, but I also kind of like look around and see people, again, just renaming things to SRE and not kind of implementing the practices, right? So it's interesting to me, and I think where I want to maybe explore this, and again, you look at the DevOpsDays website and you can see that there's dozens of events happening this year, and they're all very well attended, and so people are clearly still hungry for what we have to offer. And so I think the question is, how do we take it to the next level, and how do we help solve the new problems and adapt to the world that it is right now, and maybe help people make the next steps on their journey?
I guess. I don't know.
Right.
Just like buy more Ivan. Buy like 100 units of Ivan. That's where I work, by the way. Yeah, and buy some Ergonaut, some of that too. Whatever Sasha's selling, buy some of that too, and everything will be better.
You should definitely buy some Ergonaut.
Yeah. Buy some Ergonaut and with a side order of Ivan, and you will have all the DevOps love that you ever need, and everything's going to be amazing and awesome. So
well, it's very funny. You used to have this joke where like you can't buy DevOps, but I can sell it to you.
What do you mean used to? I still have that joke. I run that thing. I drive that joke like I stole it. So that's...
Well, I discovered that there is a clothing brand that's called DevOps, and you can buy DevOps, and there's a DevOps store.
And it's apparently very good, actually. Like they're very good leggings, very good underwear. People love it. It's and heavily endorsed by DevOps thought leaders Ian Coldwater and Kat Cosgrove. They will tell you ad nauseum how amazing DevOps leggings are. So we joked about it for years when we saw it, and then it's like it's actually quality product. So
So if you're into such things, and you can have DevOps underwear with pockets and DevOps leggings.
So you can buy DevOps. And it will probably be more useful than any other DevOps we've been trying to sell you for the last 14 years. Like,
I don't know, but it definitely will be kind of close to your heart, and
or
some
something.
other parts of it. I guess that metaphor didn't go very well.
Yeah, that really got away from you there. So.
Okay. Well, I guess this is the like the final words, and is there anything you would like to share that offer something new you learned or something you want people to check out?
Well, one thing I would like people to check out is next week is DevOpsDays Chicago. So if you are in the Chicagoland area, we still have some tickets available. We are likely going to sell out. I have been watching the number go up all day. Like every morning I post in our organizer Slack the number we're at, and I don't know why I do it in the beginning of the day, because I feel through the entire day I'm like, oh, went up another 10, another 20, another whatever. So we do have some, so go to devopsdays.org/Chicago. You'll find the registration there. I don't know, Sasha can drop something somewhere where you can see it. I'm not offering any discounts or anything because we don't need to. But I will say, if you are a student or someone where money would be getting in your way, please reach out to us. We can help you out. That said, if you're unable to attend, please again check out DevOpsDays.org/Chicago next week. We will have it. This event will be live streamed for free, no registration necessary. It's on our YouTube channel. I don't have a link to the event yet, Kevin, but if you go to YouTube and you search for DevOps Days Chicago, you'll find our channel. It'll be there. It's going to be on our website. I'm very excited about the content we're going to have there and the conversations that we're going to have. And, I also, I didn't really mention it as much, but I host a podcast called Arrested DevOps, and we're really back with a vengeance, publishing great content, or at least content. And hopefully we'll have Sasha on sometime soon. So, yeah, come check that out,
All right. Well, on that happy note, thank you very much for being here, and I'll see you all on the next Ergonatic podcast. Bye.